the paper comes out of the broader sort of academic project that I've been engaged in ever since I sort of started the PhD and working through and so on. And that's really to understand both the processes of knowledge production and to reflect upon the world that's produced from those understandings. So I work very much within the discipline, and what I try to do is bring resources from other fields to bear upon how we think about the disciplinary constructions that we're working with. But by bringing in resources from the outside, what I hope to do is open up the discipline to further transformation and reformation in service of issues of social justice in the world today. So my focus is not really, so when thinking about the issue of towards global social theory, the issue for me is much less in terms of theoretical coherence or explication, but rather to try to understand the mutual constitution of the world and knowledge that's been produced through the systematic erasure of processes of genocide, dispossession, appropriation, extraction, and enslavement. Processes which I argue, and I have argued, are fundamental to the making of the world we share, but are rarely theorized as constitutive of it. So much of my earlier work has really sought to explicate these particular issues, and I won't go into that here, but of course I'd be happy to pick up any questions and discussion. So this is really the broader context out of which this particular paper emerges. And what I'm interested in the paper is in working out an understanding of what I'm calling epistemological justice and reparation. That is how we can recognize the claims of others in terms both of respect and reconstructive response. So we had a bit of a conversation yesterday about how the arguments that we're making collectively in this sort of forum are being made with increasing frequency across the academic sort of context, but what's generally missing is a constructive response that would constitute learning, to my mind. So in this paper, what I do is take issue with the tradition of critical theory, which, whilst self-professedly critical, remains rather disinterested in critique that comes from outside of its particular parameters. So in particular, what I'm suggesting is that it remains really immune to the claims of taking seriously the claims of post-colonial and decolonial studies. And this is notwithstanding recent work which seeks to do precisely this. Before I get to that, just to say a couple of words about critical theory. I mean, it's a form of knowledge production that straddles philosophy and sociology. It has a particular theory of society that animates its normative claims. And whilst the early Frankfurt School was strongly committed to a Marxist theory of society, this has been gradually replaced by a Weberian understanding, with Axel Honneth, for example, most recently explicitly bringing Parsons back in. In both, however, from the shift from a Marxist theory of society to a Weberian theory of society, what's common to both is that there's a common elision of the colonial constitution of modernity. So whilst they think about society differently, both of them fail to address colonization as constitutive of the world within which we live. And this elision, I'll go on to argue, is present also in the work of those critical theorists who are engaging with post-colonial and decolonial thought, like Amy Allen. So her most recent book is called The End of Progress, and she uses the insights of post-colonial and decolonial theory to open up the possibility of a dialogue between these traditions and Frankfurt School critical theory. Now, critical theory sees itself as the inheritor of the Enlightenment tradition. It sees itself as providing critical responses to questions that emerge from the turn to modernity and the constitution of modern societies. But there's very little investigation of critical theory's complicity with the imperialist meta-narratives, as Amy Allen calls them, to transform themselves and to transform the way in which normativity is grounded. And the question that's raised for me, this isn't, I mean, Amy doesn't address this, but for me the issue is really a broader one in the sense of how can a theory of emancipation, so critical theory's intention is to work out a theory of emancipation, but also to think about how to actually bring about emancipation in the world. But for me, the question that's raised is how can a theory of emancipation, and particularly one that seeks to realize the practical aim of emancipating humanity from slavery, how can it fail to take into consideration the implications of the modern form of slavery, that is chattel slavery, that I believe is part of the constitution of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought in its own terms. So there's this aspect of how recognizing itself as part of the inheritor of the Enlightenment, but not taking into account the other inheritance of the Enlightenment, which was enslavement and mass enslavement at that, makes it a curiously lopsided engagement with understandings of emancipation in its own terms. And in part, that's because the way in which they constitute the notion of the social is only in terms of the modern social, and very rarely understands the modern as sort of constituted by colonialism and the other processes I was mentioning earlier. And so in this sense, there's been a long working out of what emancipation, how is emancipation constituted, what would it mean for people to be emancipated, and so on. And whilst there's no longer an impetus within critical theory to force what they call our idea of freedom on them, as Alan suggests, for Honneth, for example, the conflation of superiority and legitimacy is not problematic insofar as we do not seek to force our way of life on them. They would have to freely come to understand that freedom as determined by Europe was freedom. So it's this sense that freedom is not, that there's a particular understanding of freedom. We should no longer force that understanding of freedom upon others. Others should freely come to understand that our notion of freedom is what freedom is. And if they don't understand that, then they're free to continue living under the forms of authority that they live in. So there's no conception within Honneth that societies or peoples might be free in different sorts of ways. That's not there at all. Now, whilst more recent critical theorists such as Rainer Forst do explicitly acknowledge that modernity is constituted in conditions of coloniality, he nonetheless remains committed to the idea of progress as a fundamental condition and position from which to theorize. Forst, as Alan argues, suggests that we must be attuned to the dialectic of progress in modernity, in which every critique of progress relies, at least implicitly, on the concept of progress to formulate its critique. So his argument is basically that those people who criticize modernity for not taking into account coloniality are nonetheless committed to an idea of progress because they believe that things could be better. And so therefore modernity wins out again. So this idea of modernity without consideration of coloniality is presented as the category. The critique of post-colonial and decolonial theorists is just an afterthought in relation to that. And I would suggest actually that the modern needs to be understood much more as the colonial modern and not governed by a teleology of unfolding progress. Because as Alan herself asks, how can critical theory be truly critical if it remains committed to an imperialist meta-narrative? So this is, so the project that Alan has set up, I think, is an incredibly interesting one, and it's one of the first times that Frankfurt School Critical Theory has seriously engaged with post-colonial and decolonial thought to try and open up the grounds of critical theory to this critique that's also existing but has very rarely been taken into consideration. But the point at which I would depart from the questions or the provocations that Alan is making is really in terms of the fact that at the end of the book, she nonetheless remains committed to an idea of progress. She nonetheless remains committed to an idea that the world can be better and that we can create freedom sort of more broadly, or that there's a particular understanding of freedom that others will eventually be included within, without necessarily thinking about how those boundaries of inclusion, whether the others wish to be included in the particular definition that's being presented by Alan herself or not. And in a sense, her concern is, I think, also much more methodological in the sense that she's trying to bring Foucault into conversation with critical theory, and what she's doing with post-colonial and decolonial theory is in part opening up a space within critical theory to enable Foucauldian understandings of history and historicity to be engaged with in order to argue for new resources, new ways of thinking about the past. And in part, I would suggest that it's not straightforward that we need new ways of thinking about the past. In part, what Enlightenment thought, or those who claim to be the inheritors of the Enlightenment need to do, is to start from enslavement, to question their earlier commitment to progress, and examine what would constitute progress today in light of that history. So it's not that we need brand new ideas or brand new whatever. In part, it's just that we need to reckon with the history that's been missed out in the way in which critical theory itself is being established. And here we might sort of use the words of Homi Bhabha to think about, that one way of doing this is to shift the frame. So there's a particular frame through which we view modernity, for example, which is always the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. But if we shifted that frame to ask, what is this now of modernity? Who defines the present from which we speak? Then that would require us to re-examine our conceptual paradigms from the perspectives of those others who are usually relegated to the margins. That would both take into account the claims being made by others, their historical presence within the processes we're talking about, and hopefully seek to reconstruct the conceptual paradigm that had previously excluded them. And so in this sense, the key point of the paper really is that instead of a focus of emancipation, we should make the focus reparation. And then instead of a focus on progress, we should make the focus reparations. Because the only way to think through issues of justice in the present is to make good on the injuries of the past. And that would be much more, for me, it would be a much more adequate thing to do in terms of focusing on issues of repair and reparation than simply an idea of progress into a future that's unknown and others are required to sort of come into. And there's other arguments that are sort of making there, but that's a sort of brief overview. So if I leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Gurminder. Thanks. So I'm going to begin the discussion, and it's a great paper as all the other ones, and I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience who also want to join the discussion. So I will. Let's see, it's 1:15. So I will maybe we'll talk for maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll discuss together, I think.
Yeah.
So one, I wanted to pick up a couple of things, mainly around this. I haven't read Amy Allen's book. I didn't have time to do that. But I wanted to pick up on her and your ideas first of critical theory, what that is, and how it is conceived in its Marxist phase, and then in its sort of more, as we call it, its more sort of liberal Weberian phase, and then Amy Allen then suggests that this should now go into a decolonial or post-colonial phase, and this is what where you then pick up that it should move into a phase speaking seriously about reparations and epistemological justice. So what I'm going to ask you, I think, is about, are there any resources within critical theory itself in these earlier phases which may contain the beginnings of that too? That's one of the things that I'm going to ask you. But before that, I mean, just signaling then that we have a sort of a new perspective on our questions for the symposium on the table, and that is the question of a global critical theory. That's because that's what Amy Allen seeks to do, as I understand it, and also, I mean, that's the tendency within which you are moving this to. So what would that be, and what, in which ways can a global social theory be a global critical theory, and should it be that, and what should it be criticizing, and progress being, of course, one huge topic here, and Enlightenment, the Enlightenment legacy also. Yes, but I think I will begin here, and that is to say, when you are saying that to just sort of frame this in relation to other similar projects or related projects. When you're saying that, how can a theory of emancipation from slavery fail to account the actual facts of chattel slavery that went on at the same time as emancipation? I was wondering here, the work of Susan Buck-Morss and this whole discourse on Hegel and Haiti, because it seems to me that this is also one of the arguments that she's making precisely, not in relation, although, I mean, she's also, as I see it, a critical theorist, and probably, yeah, but we should discuss that. But when she's making that claim in relation to the early Enlightenment, to Rousseau, Hegel, Kant, and the grand philosophical tradition of the European emancipation and the European Enlightenment, in which way would you position that work? Because, and specifically perhaps then, I mean, Susan Buck-Morss's work, but also on the Haitian Trouillot, these scholars who have been making this argument about the Enlightenment also, although in a more kind of within the field of, I mean, intellectual history and history, and a little bit too in what you would call cultural studies. Yeah, so then this is just to sort of frame your project also within these broader frames. And I don't know what Amy Allen does with this, but she seems to be speaking about the later moment in critical theory, mainly with Honneth and Habermas and Faust. Yeah, so.
Okay, so there's lots of questions there. I'll try and cover a couple of them. I think in terms of the first one, so if we think about the development of the tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory specifically, that the establishment of the Frankfurt School and those who were engaged in that particular project at the very outset were explicitly Marxists. And in part what they were trying to do was bring in a Marxist critique to disrupt the liberal what comes to be seen as the liberalism of Hegel and Kant in particular ways, with their focus on the self and subjectivity, but to bring class in as a disruptive category to break out of the bourgeois settled understanding of the state and self and so on. And over the period of, as the generations go on, there's obviously the disruption that occurs on the continent in the mid-20th century, which has a lot of people leave and begin to actually question the very project of critical theory. So you have Adorno and Horkheimer, and particularly Adorno with his negative dialectics, questioning the idea of whether progress is possible after the Holocaust and so on. And then there's an attempt in the period after, in the post-war period, that the recuperative activities of the German state, to me it seems as if that comes to stand in for the work that critical theory would have needed to do to also to make sense of the Holocaust in its particular understanding of progress and emancipation. And I think in a way they evade and avoid the question by making that particular event an aberration. By making it an aberration, they can continue, they can have a line that's continuous, acknowledge the horror of what happened, but say that it was somehow deviant, disruptive, an aberration, and so on, and therefore not really have to think about the implications of that tradition in relation to what it was that's happened. And that recuperative aspect has led to initially a sort of an unself-conscious take-up of Parsons. So whereas before Marx was used to criticize bourgeois society, there's now almost an affirmation of bourgeois society, implicit within Habermas, but then much more explicit within Axel Honneth. So his latest book, Freedom's Right, he talks about how the Parsonian theory of society is what underpins his new normative claim. And so there's a giving up of class and a giving up of the disruption. And in a sense, I guess what I would hope, and I don't know whether if this is Amy Allen's project or not, but partly what I would hope is that with this new take-up of, or the beginnings of a conversation with post-colonial and decolonial theory, that could provide a similar sort of disruptive moment within the tradition of critical thought that the engagement with Marx had done in the early 20th century, to now bring colonization as a central aspect that needs to be theorized in terms of thinking about the issue of progress. I think the commitment to progress is problematic within critical theory, and there's an elision between a normative commitment to progress and an idea that it can be empirically, historically demonstrated. And whilst they can account for the Holocaust, as I was saying before, as an aberration, if they recognize the Holocaust as part of the line of colonial genocides that are happening more generally, then that would have to cause them to radically rethink their understandings of enlightenment by recognizing that the Holocaust wasn't an aberration. It was part of a generalized process of European domination in the world, which resulted in the genocides of millions of people. And then how do we think about progress if we take their deaths seriously? So in that sense, that there's that sort of genealogy. To go to the Susan Burke-Morse issue, I mean, one thing that I would have to say at the outset, I don't know if people know, but Susan Burke-Morse's article, Hegel in Haiti, uses the work of an African scholar, I forget his name at the moment, who wrote a PhD thesis on Hegel et Haiti at the Sorbonne. And it's briefly referenced within her later revision of when she turns the article into the book. There's much more of an acknowledgement of the fact that she got the inspiration for the article from the African scholar, but not sufficient in terms of the extent of the argument that's being made. So other scholars have commented about how there has been work linking Hegel and Haiti that was prior to Susan Burke-Morse. And so that points to the politics of knowledge production in terms of who is able to use the work of others without appropriate citation, appropriate engagement, and so on. And then who gets cited in turn, and those sorts of issues. So I think it's important just to state that. But nonetheless, that argument is an important argument in the sense that it's not to say that nobody has ever considered these issues in the past previously, but rather to think about how the grand narratives that are constructed around events don't take into account these issues. So when we think about understandings of democracy, they're usually taught in terms of the French Revolution and the American Declaration. They're very rarely taught in terms of the Haitian Revolution. And it's not because there aren't histories, there aren't intellectual histories, there aren't cultural studies, accounts of Haiti. It's because within the standard the core disciplines, if you like, of politics, economics, and so on, there isn't the reconstructive work being done to take these other accounts and rework our concepts on the basis of that. So I think that's partly why there is a plethora of work on all this other stuff. But for me, the issue is how do we bring that in to the disciplinary construction and transform it?
No, I see. That's a good point, and that clarifies a lot for me. When I come to, I have read very little of. I've read a great deal of Habermas, very little of Honneth, and nothing by this guy Reinefors. Mm-hmm. But for me, coming to this, to your essay, because I come to it with the sense that, well, critical theory, that's what is we sometimes also call Western Marxism, or what Perry Anderson calls Western Marxism, that tradition, and this is what I would also like to have this point clarified, because it seems to me that because in that phase, let's say Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Marcuse, Adorno, Benjamin, that group of Marxist critical theories, they definitely saw, and I think the most famous book is, of course, Dialectics of Enlightenment, and this is the questioning, the radical questioning of the idea of progress is there from the early 1930s up until, well, throughout Adorno's work and all that. And then, and also this idea of the Holocaust as not being an aberration, but precisely being the logical outcome of the tradition of the Enlightenment. It's also there. So I was wondering, I mean, how does it come about then? And I'm not questioning your point, but I think your point is probably valid for this later phase of critical theory that you are discussing. But this seems to require a kind of periodization within critical theory. And then the question that one asks is, well, why is that later or contemporary phase of critical theory, why can it be, for which reason can it come back to this embracement of progress and this construction of the Holocaust as an aberration, whereas they, I mean, in the legacy that they build on, I mean, this was clearly not the case. I mean, progress was fascism, or it led to fascism, but it could also lead to utopia. And the Holocaust was a kind of definitely something that, a logical outcome of the instrumentalization of reason in Enlightenment.
I mean, I have to say, I think that's one of the things that I find quite puzzling myself, in the sense that there is such a strong critique in the immediate post-war period and over the 40s and so on, that how is it that contemporary critical theorists can sort of avoid that critique? And I think it's in part by devolving the work of people like Adorno and Benjamin to an aesthetic component, focus on the other aspects that they're saying. There's not as much engagement with this idea of the end of progress that is so that's a phrase that comes out of Adorno that Amy Allen uses as the title of her book. There's very little engagement with that aspect, and it's almost as if, well, we know things were terrible, but we've atoned for it, and so therefore we can continue with our commitment to progress. And if you sort of say, well, I don't, so when I've questioned that commitment to progress, the issue is, but how can you be against progress? Surely you believe, critique is progress. And I sort of think, well, there's something odd there, where progress is only defined in terms of progress for Europe, regardless of the costs of lives of others, that enables what happens in Europe to be able to happen. So it's almost as if their death means, the death of others means very little to the affirmation of progress in Europe. And my concern is, well, this can't stand. We have to disentangle a normative commitment to progress to any understanding of its historical instantiation. I don't know how we can talk about progress in the context of the history of the 19th, 20th, from the 15th century onwards, it's a difficult topic. And progress then, for me, would have to be something that repaired the wounds of the past. And so the focus for me would be reparations rather than progress as a way of achieving emancipation, because I don't see emancipation occurring without an accounting for and a resolving of those injustices.
But in saying that, you're also very close, I think, to a kind of to Walter Benjamin, who was saying almost that the angel of progress is flying backwards, and she's heaping catastrophe upon catastrophe, and we have to try to resurrect the victims who are crushed under the wheels of progress, and so on and so forth. And so and it's almost as if, well, one can make the argument, and it has been made, that there is this claim in, I think, in Walter Benjamin, but also then in the Adorno and Horkheimer, both of whom admire Benjamin's work and are extremely influenced by it, and that there is that idea, I would argue, of epistemological justice in their work. They don't, I mean, and this is the question that we could discuss, they don't reference the colonial domain, they don't reference imperialism, but they reference the victims of history and the brutality of capitalism, and it clearly has this kind of global resonance in certain passages. So what? But what do you make of that then? I mean, or would you agree with?
No, I mean, I'm happy to take resources wherever I find them, if I find them to be useful. So I have nothing against, I mean, I think Hegel has actually interesting ways of thinking that we need to sort of think about again in relation to his theory of history. It's not straightforwardly as problematic as the way in which it's being presented, but there are ways to sort of think about what he was thinking about at that time. So instead of, again, I think partly the issue is the scholarship that follows an individual is often much more one-sided than the work of the individual themselves. So my critique isn't of the individuals of the past, but rather how we interpret them in the present. And I think in terms of thinking about Benjamin and the others and their critique of progress, well, if we were to, it's this notion of progress. So in a sense, they're still, so even though they think that the outcomes of progress are problematic, it's nonetheless progress because they don't include the whole of humanity in their understanding of progress. So was it progress for the Bengali peasants to be killed in the famines produced by British colonialism? Well, it was progress for the British because they got that, but it wasn't progress for those peasants. And so in that sense, if you could have a broader lens of who, and if we were to understand progress in their terms as effectively the march of white supremacy, which is what it was, then we would begin to disentangle the evaluative connotations of the notion of progress from a process of mass genocide. And I think that's the really problematic thing, that they won't give up this idea that modern societies are inherently positive on one level. Yes, we know there were some bad things, but these bad things are at the outskirts. At the heart, modernity is a project of emancipation. And I want to argue that modernity at heart is a project of the death and destruction of much of the world's population, the appropriation of resources, extraction, dispossession, and enslavement. If that is what modernity is, what does it mean to constitute a theory of emancipation where some people's lives were enriched at the cost of the lives of others? I can't stand for that. So that's and I can't understand how people who are committed to an idea of critical theory refuse to engage with that broader context for what they're presenting as the context for their theory of emancipation.
Yeah, no, I would. This is extremely interesting because I think one of the sources for precisely saying what you are saying would be, because I don't think that there is in Benjamin and Adorno an idea of this progress, because they end in an extremely tragic idea of modernity as a self-destructive process, precisely for these reasons. But I mean, we could.
But again, it's that focus on self-destructive when it's been other destructive. So in a sense, it's because it's bad for us that it's bad.
No, but
it hasn't been bad for the, but there's no reflection on its badness for the rest of humanity.
Oh yes.
Straightforward.
Oh yes, I would argue that there is, but we could continue that discussion later. But I would not. I mean, what do you think? And what do you think? Because there is a kind of barrier between the history of critical theory and the non-European world. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. And although I would argue that it can be seen as present in other ways. But there is, I mean, they don't speak about it. Mm-hmm. Adorno hates jazz, and he relates it to some kind of racist idea of Africanism. And so every time they touch on the real issues, they are very strange, and because they are sort of elite German Jewish intellectuals, and they have a kind of way of simply not relating to it because it's not the world of culture. So that's absolutely true. But one could speculate what would have happened. I mean, had the dialectic of enlightenment, that book, and Adorno and Horkheimer, what would have happened if they would have encountered Aimé Césaire or Senghor, or even if they had just read Joseph Conrad and things like that? I mean, surely they would have recognized the echoes. One interesting thing that comes out of this is that this broader issue of the global, our theme for the day, and I will end with that question, and then I will open it up. I mean, so Amy Allen tries to open this up by relying, if I understand you, on Foucault and some. I don't know what she's referencing and she's using from decolonial arguments. And so I'd invite you just to say something about this, because you also state at the beginning that there would be two ways, two paths to a globalization or a global social theory. One would be the kind of to supplement it with additional sort of sources, references, voices, and bring all of them into a kind of dialogue and conversation. And you say that, well, this is not your project. Your project is precisely what you outlined here now, which is that of a internal reconstruction, and in this case of the I mean, how to put it, of the theory of a kind of global theory of the modern, which is also the colonial. So how will you bring that project? It would be interesting to hear. How would you relate it then to this? I mean, is that project itself a project of epistemological justice, as you talk about it? Is that the project of reconstructing the notion of modernity, coloniality? Is that in itself, will that a project of epistemological justice? And is that then the second step on that, is that a project of reparation?
I think it's certainly the start of that. So the work that scholars have done, so in a sense, the critique of colonialism doesn't begin with post-colonial or decolonial theory. It begins with the moment of colonization, where people resist that imposition of those forms of life upon them and all of that. So it's about, for me, it's about recovering that history as central to the formation of our concepts. So in a sense, partly the argument that I've always made is that the concepts that we use within our disciplines are constructed not just abstractly, but on the basis of referring to particular sorts of histories. Those histories are very parochial and they're limited, and they don't take into account the broader consequences of the events that they describe. And so if we were to take a step backwards almost and broaden our view of what history is, and then think about how those concepts should be constructed on the basis of those histories, that would lead to better concepts to deal with the problems that we're engaged with at the moment. And so my own commitments are not to produce a global theory of anything or to produce a theory of the global or any of those sorts of things, but rather to take the global as the perspective from which we engage with our work.